Hello, everybody. This is Lauren Seibold. I'm here today with Kendra Arsenault, and Kendra is a student at Andrews University and has an interesting story, things that's been going on, and a ministry that she's been doing. Sounded like a wonderful ministry, Kendra. I'm looking forward to finding out more about it. Tell me, first of all, a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? How did you find yourself going into ministry?
Hi. I am originally born in Panama, but grew up most of my life in California. And I've been attending seminary for about 3 years now, and this is my last semester. The whole project kind of got started because, I spent a lot of time after I graduated UCLA. I spent about 8 or 9 years doing a lot of independent videography, photography type work. And I was so interested in learning more about the Bible. I was so just taken back by a lot of the new information I was understanding at the seminary. And I really wanted to give an opportunity for other people to hear these conversations that were taking
Hmm.
place. And so our first kind of production we did was relooking at women's ordination. And there were some books and professors had written some articles. And I thought, man, this is a really interesting take. I was at the GC in 2015, and I don't remember having these resources or hearing these perspectives from a biblical space. It wasn't just like this, liberal take on the Bible. It was very much conservative, high view of scripture. So that's kind of how I got interested. And I wanted to create like a TED talk for Adventists and so in
Oh,
that way.
so let's go back just a little bit, Kendra.
Mhm.
Uh, this was you did this in the form of a podcast or an audio or a video podcast.
Both. Yes. It was an audio and a video podcast. Correct.
What was it called?
AdventNext.
Is this was this sponsored by anybody, or was this something you were doing on your own?
So it was sponsored by the Adventist Learning Community, and it was a great opportunity. They were looking to really try new projects, and I had suggested doing an Adventist TED Talk type
Mhm.
deal, but we didn't have the resources to do something as big production as a stage and an audience.
Hmm.
So we kind of scaled it down to something like a podcast, and it turned out to be just the right size.
Mhm, mhm. And did you get a lot of listeners? Did you get a good response to it?
We did. Over time, we had a consistent, 5 or 6 thousand listeners every month on the podcast. And
Wow.
on the video side, we had, 4,500 subscribers, but we had maybe like 100,000 views a month. So we had a lot of
Astonishing.
traffic coming through. Yeah.
Astonishing. That's really good. I'm really excited to hear that, especially about the sort of topics you were doing. Now, tell me some of the topics that you worked on and the sorts of people that you brought in to talk.
Yeah. So, kind of my philosophy behind it was I wanted to go deeper on maybe some issues that might be a little bit debatable. So, we talked about stuff like the Trinity and some of the controversy that people are dealing with at the local levels. Like I said, my first episode was on women's ordination, and it was really tackling something very controversial, looking at different perspectives. We look at African American SDA history
Mhm.
and kind of the controversies behind that and the development of regional conferences. We've taken a variety of kind of tough topics that local congregations are often wrestling through, and we try to tackle them with information and research.
Mhm. How long did the podcast go?
This was our third year, so
Oh, you've
so
been doing this for a while.
we've been doing it for a while. Yeah.
And how long were the conversations generally?
Conversations, they were around 35 minutes all the way to about an hour. And so sometimes I would try to cut up long conversations into multiple shows, but some shows just kind of merited have been run the full length of it.
Yeah,
So it
yeah,
depended.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you were obviously a good interviewer because you kept it going for a long time, and people seemed to respond well. Uh, Now, you did get to one topic, as I recall from our conversation, that did not please people quite as much. Could you tell us about how that came about?
Yeah. So, we're on the heels of Pride Month, and usually I try and do episodes that stay kind of in line with some of the calendar holidays. Like Black History Month. I really try to make sure we have a focus on that. So this was Pride Month, and I thought, I really think that our church could do a better job at addressing these issues. So last year I did one where we were looking at the side B perspective, which is about as progressive as Adventism gets at this point, where we say you can identify as gay, but you have to remain celibate for the rest of
Right.
your life. And even though that's on the books, that's not necessarily how it breaks down in practice. A lot of people are still very afraid for anyone to identify as gay, and
Mm-hmm.
people are losing their job, even if they abide by that on the books type definition. So
Yes,
I
it's
addressed that
actually
last.
voted by the NAD, which when I heard it, I had two thoughts, and you probably thought this too. One was that's not enough. The other was, but it's pretty astonishing that they actually voted that.
Yeah, in some ways they're kind of progressive in that sense,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that that was very interesting. Kind of like, okay, we're not we're not going to say you can't identify as gay. You have to go to conversion therapy. That's we're saying you can keep the identity, but these are the restrictions. And in some ways, it dissects a person identity from like who you are. Then just sex is just this act,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's kind of dissecting a person from the entirety of what sexuality actually is.
Oh,
But
very
that's
good.
another conversation.
Yeah, that's a very good analysis. I like that.
Yeah, and so we tackled that last year just to kind of get people just interested in the idea that if you get somebody in your congregation who does identify as gay, like don't shun them for that identity, and there is space within our community for that. And this year, we had Pastor Alicia Johnston's coming out with a new book,
Oh, yes.
um,
Alicia is
LGBT.
a good friend of mine, and I think her book is marvelous.
So I was so curious about this, and I've heard a lot of good things about it already. And me personally, like I've been doing a lot of queer theology as far as studying and reading on these books. It's not something that we have access to in Adventism. Like there's one book that we have, Homosexuality and Marriage, and that's pretty much the manual. But there's so much theology that is challenging some of the perceptions that are there that I wanted to hear an answer to that in some ways. And so she was coming out with this book, and I thought it would be a great conversation starter. Let's go ahead and like let's bring this on. And so we talked about some contents in her book, and I got a lot of pushback, which was expected.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted, for me, the big thing is how do we make space for these conversations? Like because whether or not you agree that somebody, whether you come to an affirming position or not, I wanted to remove the stigma and for people to stop saying that people who come to an affirming view don't have a high view of scripture. And as Pastor Johnston was talking about, like you can still have a high view of scripture and come to an affirming conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And if we remove that kind of judgment from people, that's kind of what I wanted to do, remove the stigma. Then the week after that, I brought on my friend Paul, Pastor Paul Anthony Turner, and we had a discussion about just making space and wanting to address fears that people have, and kind of talking a little bit about his experience and his journey, and kind of hoping for the future and the ways that we can begin these conversations. And at the end of that episode, I kind of revealed like, hey, the reason why this conversation is so important to me is I'm also queer. And I think that there are a lot of people in our church who are too afraid to self-disclose. And so, how do we begin creating safe spaces where fear is not the environment that people are living in? So and then that didn't go over so well. So
So that was your coming out.
yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of my friends know, but this is more of like, hey, people are queer and they do theology. So
Mm-hmm.
kind of helping to um, destigmatize that conversation.
Yeah, yeah. And so what happened after that? What was the reaction?
Um, So I think like after like 2 or 3 days after it dropped, I think some people got phone calls and it was really scary for some people. I think the part that scared them the most was probably that I identified as bisexual, and maybe not, right? Maybe they just didn't like the conversation. But I had this conversation 3 weeks ago with Pastor Alicia Johnston, and there was pushback, but it wasn't to this level. And so when I came out as queer, it was definitely like very incendiary, and I think my company, the organization I work for, got a lot of pressure from, I don't know, their sponsors, or it wasn't quite clear to me. But there are people in power who have money, whoever the shadow people are, who didn't want me to host or be a part of that program anymore. And so they let me go.
Now, let's just be clear. This does not affect your ability to graduate with your degree from Andrews University, does it?
Not that I know of. I still have my one last semester in the fall, and I don't believe that it should. But we'll see. But I don't think so.
I hope not as well, Kendra, because I do think that we're probably advanced enough now to not kick out our students who identify with different gender identities or attractions. I hope we're at that point. Why do you think it is, Kendra, that we are seem so terrified of LGBTQ people? I mean, I used to think that it was just the texts, but I don't think it's that anymore.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of fear, and I think it comes out in different spaces. So I think, for example, you know, like let's just move it out of politics and just talk about it from a biblical
Yes.
standpoint. Like I think that there's a lot at stake. People recognize that salvation of the soul is a big deal. And so there's a lot at stake. And I think that people want surety, people want absolute. And to begin to look at scripture and say, for me, I've had to do this as a woman in ministry. When Paul says a woman should not speak in church, I have to say, but why do I feel called to speak? Right now, I have to wrestle with this innate calling that I feel, my experience, the culture that I lived in, the history and the progress of what we understand about gender equality. I've had to do that work to even find space in this space, right?
Mhm.
And so I look at that scripture and I say, well, what's the context? What was he talking about? What was the culture that he was speaking in? Is it possible that Paul himself was influenced by a culture that he lived in, where he might have come to these views? Like, so what's all the context behind that? And when it comes to like homosexuality, we don't tend to do that same exegesis. Is what we see today the same as what he was talking about in Rome in 60 AD, right? Are we really comparing apples and apples, or is this apples and oranges? And so to begin that journey of like having those questions, I think is really scary for people because, you don't, the sure thing is just to take everything and not understand context and just read it and be sure of it, and to do a very rigid theology. So I think that's a part of the fear. Like I said, a lot is at stake, and I think
Mhm.
and I understand. I get it.
Yeah, I think you're being generous. I mean, I think it would be nice to think that it was only a hermeneutical problem, and it certainly is a hermeneutical problem. But
Mhm.
I think there's also a very personal fear. There's a desire to find these a prohibition there because people are fearful that homosexuality is caught or taught
Mhm.
somehow, and there's no evidence for that.
Right.
Yet that's what people fear. And so, how do we use the Bible to help people get past these fears? Now, I'll throw this out to you, Kendra. I've always felt, as a pastor, that my ministry starts with the people, not with the text. I know that's a very controversial thing to say. I've had people really jump on me for that, but I always believe you exegete the community before you exegete the text,
Mm.
and you look for what the needs are, and help people to try to find ways to make life better for them.
Yeah.
And in this case, the first step for me has always been get to know people.
Mm.
It seems to me knowledge, friendship, is fatal to prejudice.
Yeah.
And again, that's starting with community. We're building out of community rather than saying, okay, let's build a religion out of text. So you build the religion out of the community and then bring the text to bear. I don't know if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And I think, there's another side to it other than just the text. Depending on where you're plugged into your media, there is a lot of rhetoric that the LGBTQ community is going to be the downfall of, the Christian fabric of our nation, right? And I think there is a lot of fear mongering and what you said, like, that it's being caught. And it's because we're not in communication with LGBTQ communities that we can hold these prejudices, because it's hard to come face to face with people and have a text that causes us to act inhumanely towards somebody else, right? And so, we often have this idea that sola scriptura means solo scriptura, right? But it's not only the text. Sola scriptura means, yes, this is our final authority, but we also employ reason and experience and this moral judgment that God is that is fabricating inside of us, and that is the journey of sanctification.
There is such a thing as a natural theology, Kendra.
Mhm.
There's a theology that comes out of existence, out of living, and existential theology, if you will. And I've always felt like if you want a proof of that, the greatest sense of the greatest expression of natural theology is the golden rule. It doesn't say do unto others what you found a rule to do. It says do unto others, consult your own feelings and find out how you like to be treated, and then be uh, the same toward others. Now, it has its limitations, but it is still the core of a natural theology.
Yeah, yeah. And I like that because, our feelings have been something we've been taught to be afraid of,
Mm-hmm.
right? That we have to have reason that overpowers feelings, because all feelings are evil in some sense. Or there's something that's of the lower nature that must be mastered by the higher nature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I just don't think that that's a holistic approach to why God even gave us feelings in the first place,
Yes.
right? Um, I think that that's where the seed of our empathy lives, right? We know what something feels like, and we don't want to do that to somebody else, or we know what it feels like. We want to do something nice for somebody else. So if we're not consulting our feelings, or if we're treating it as in opposition to reason, then it's very natural for someone to say, it doesn't matter how you feel, it doesn't matter who you're attracted to, it doesn't matter what your lived experience is. You need to fit in the box, and that's it.
My friend Alden Thompson, and I don't know if you know Alden Thompson, he has written very often about this matter of inspiration. He said everyone, all the interpreters, actually do consult culture and feelings. He said they just don't admit it.
Yeah.
Even the conservative interpreters are subjective in their interpretation. And I love that. To me, that makes perfect sense. Before we're kind of going long here, but let me ask you just a couple of questions to finish up. One is, what's the future of AdventNext?
I have no clue what the future is because I don't own it. And so I was kind of running it and moving thoughts along in that area. So I have no idea what's going to happen with it. I hope that it continues to create wonderful content, and they find an interviewer that is interested in very interesting questions.
And then my other question is, what does ministry hold for you? You clearly have a heart. for people. What do you want to do?
I want to find a space where I feel integrated. And this is something that I see myself moving more into a space where I maybe do my own podcast and begin writing my own books because when this is very interesting this last week. I've been really understanding that I am bicultural, I'm biracial, I'm bisexual.
Mhm.
And in that means that I'm constantly straddling two worlds in my identities, right? So bicultural, I was born in Panama, but I grew up in the United States. I'm biracial. What does that mean to belong to two different groups of people with two different perspectives and worldviews and lived experiences? What does it mean to be bisexual? And I think, and even bicultural in the sense of there's a Christian part of me, and there's
Mhm.
also a part of me that is very a part of my community, right?
Yeah.
And wanting to live in harmony with my community. So how do I straddle those two worlds where I don't have to cut off one, right? I'm not trying to be completely secular and cut off my Christian identity. And I don't want to be Christian and cut off this connection that I have with the greater community.
Mm.
So building a space where I can be integrated and building a space that also talks about those tensions that I think all of us live in to some level, and to begin to have honest conversations about what does it mean to walk in the in between spaces. And so that's what I'm hoping to kind of launch myself into the future doing.
Kendra, it's been just a pleasure to meet you. And thank you so much for talking to me and for
Mhm.
sharing this with the Adventist Today listeners. I understand you're going to be writing a little bit more about this, and we'll keep in mind what's coming out here within the next few days as you talk about it a little more formally. But thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for being a listening ear, and I hope your listeners continue to do the work of investigation and to be curious about theology rather than fearful of it.